Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show. Outlander is the show about Highlander Jamie Fraser and his time-travelling nurse-wife Claire in the midst of the 1743 Jacobite uprising. Episode 11, Vengeance is Mine, starts out much like last week did, with Claire doing a kind of nursey bit while Jamie, Charlie and the generals argue an awful lot. You see, the generals are all against marching on London because they're in Manchester now, and while the Prince and Jamie are both dead set on pressing the advantage instead of retreating home for the winter, it turns out that literally only Jamie actually wants to side with the Prince, and Charlie gets right cross with everyone about it. Meanwhile, Claire's yanking out teeth and Rupert's all talking about Angus to anyone that wants to listen, but history seems to be playing out exactly the way that Claire remembers it from the history books, and there doesn't seem to be anything they can do about it. So Jamie promises Team Lallybroch he'll get them home safe for the winter. Then he gets naked and moody and Gaelic and doing poetry in the firelight while Claire sleeps. Aww. The next day, Dougal comes in all cross because they've been ordered away to Inverness. Seems that the generals don't really like Jamie's fawning devotion to the Prince in the face of their military advice, so they all troop off back to bonny Scotland, and they're enjoying a nice wee rest and a picnic when Redcoat starts shooting folk all over the place. Luckily, Jamie and the rest of the main cast escape while presumably leaving the extras to their doom, and Rupert gets an eye out off of an English soldier's gun, and then they have to hide in a church while Claire sorts him out and calls him a pirate. But the British have found them, and they're threatening to burn down the church, or at least burn down the roof, because stone doesn't really burn that well. So after Jamie heroically volunteers to give himself up, and Claire tells him that he's stupid and then does exactly the same thing herself, she pretends to be a captured Englishwoman just like she did a couple of weeks ago, and they manage to buy their freedom by handing her over, and all their guns. Claire ends up being taken to a nearby pub, and Jim and Murtaugh plan to come and rescue her because eventually she's going to be at one of the British camps. But however, the plans end up changing and she's taken to a nearby bigwig's house. Luckily, she ends up meeting up with the wee mute Shuggy, Jamie's pal from the first season, and he's begging outside the pub, and she manages to stage a conversation in front of him so that he knows to tell Jamie where to find her. Anyway, Claire's piece gets ruined a bit when it turns out that the local nobleman is none other than the Duke of Sandringham, who's chilling at his sort of other house of his, must be his summer retreat or something, and he pretends that he doesn't know her, but then tells her that, he actually needs Jamie's help to help him escape because the British have the house surrounded and he's being watched 24/7. So Claire agrees and she writes a badly written Gaelic note to Shuggy, and then he gives it to Jamie and Murtaugh. Turns out that the wee drippy Mary Watson is also there, because she's Sandringham's goddaughter for reasons, and she's very cross at having to be married off to some loyalist chap. So Claire argues on her behalf, and the Duke fobs her off, but mentions that, he's managed to get the Redcoats to leave for the night, and this might be good for everyone, until halfway through the conversation, Claire notices the birthmark on the manservant Danton's hand, and it's the same one that happened on the attacker in France when Claire got attacked, and Mary got raped, and Claire suddenly smells a rat, and sure enough, it turns out that Sandringham was actually behind the attack as a favour to the Comte Saint-Germain, although he did manage to talk it down from a murder to a rape, so that's something, I suppose. Anyway, it turns out it's a double trap because the Redcoats are only actually pretending to leave so that Jamie gets lured into the trap, and Rapey Danton locks Claire in a room, and just about Team Jamie are about to arrive, and Claire's getting all frantic. She gets let out by Mary, who used a secret door or something, and seems very confused by all of it. Anyway, Claire dashes down to the kitchen to escape, but runs right into Sandringham, who's having a midnight snack, and they end up having a long drawn-out chat about the death of Saint-Germain, interrupted by Mary, who keeps getting told to go to bed. And then she tries to escape and bumps into a Redcoat, and then Hugh, and then Danton, but luckily Danton doesn't see Hugh or the knocked-out sentry Redcoat. Anyway, Mary gets told to go to bed again, but then suddenly Jamie and Murtaugh storm in and they take down Danton, and Sandringham tries to talk his way out of it, but Claire tells him he was behind the attack, and wee Mary grows a spine and stabs Danton up inside his kidneys, and then Murtaugh goes full Lizzie Borden on Sandringham, chopping his head off with an axe and showing it to the womenfolk. And after that, well, there's nothing really left but getting the hell out of Dodge for Team Fraser. So what did I think? Well, after 2 weeks of solid war stories and big picture stuff, it's definitely time for a more intimate and detailed episode about the main characters. And truly, an awful lot has happened in this episode. So much so that by the time we got to Sandringham's house, I felt that the episode must be nearly over and surely this was going to be a two-parter. But no, in the end, they tied it up all neatly. I really liked seeing Simon Callow again, and, the guy who played Hugh. It was really nice to see the callbacks that have been happening in the show for the last couple of weeks, like with the Englishman in the episode previously. And it was nice to see that icky, creepy, fawning nobleman one last time, and also nice to see him die. It was really good to actually see him finally get his comeuppance for all his nastiness. It gives everything a really good real-world feel to actually have these characters coming back. And in the same ways, we got good moments from Dougal and Rupert again this week, and a nice return from Fergus, even though he was only in the episode for a couple of lines. And oh, that eye operation scene, that was nasty, more so even than the tooth pulling. but it was really, nasty in a good way, very visceral. And it's also interesting to see that this week's episode was actually written by Diana Galbadon herself, which goes to show that, the normal writing staff have really done a decent job of getting the voice and the feel of that right, because her episode didn't feel too different from the usual scripts in terms that you actually felt like it wasn't being written by a completely different person, which could have been an issue because, adaptation, and that's the way it works. But this week I've actually got a lot to say about Grumps, and most of them revolve slightly around the script and therefore around herself. And I think that really needs to be said. But even though I have a fair suspicion that a few of my viewers might disagree quite heavily with me on this. But anyway, here goes. You came here for my opinions. There's too much of Jamie being a hero in this episode. Far too much heroic stuff and grandstanding and look at me do a noble thing. Now, what do I mean? Now, don't get me wrong. I like seeing Jamie do cool stuff. But take the opening scene of Jamie and the Generals. You've got two clever, learned generals giving sound military advice to the prince on why they don't want to march on London. And then you've got, Charlie doing his usual Deus Vulting and God says so, and we should just do it because king and country and blah, 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 and I'm very cross with you all. Now, you expect from him that kind of reaction, but Jamie's supposed to be clever. But instead, Jamie starts trying to shame everyone with idealism and loyalty above everything else. And it sounds great in theory, but in actuality, he comes across as like a Charlie fanboy or some kind of blinkered idealist rather than actually having a sound argument. Because he doesn't actually give a military reason to do it, other than it's only going to take 5 days. But the fact is, 5 days to march on London, which they can't possibly hold, with then 3 armies between them and Scotland. They'd just be annihilated. It doesn't make any sense. Now, we're predisposed to side with Jamie because he's Jamie. But for me, that all fell flat, and exactly the same thing happened later on when he tried to heroically sacrifice himself at the church. I mean, it just seemed like a strange move of immediately, I don't know how we'll get out of this one. I know, I'll sacrifice myself. And it's such a Jamie thing to do. And then even then Claire turned around and went, no, that's not a great plan. You shouldn't do that. But, it was him just being like, look at me, I'm great. And to crown it all, there was even that wee pointless scene later on of him and Murtaugh about stealing the horses. Now, maybe that's from the book directly, it could well be, but that scene was so short and so bizarre to me that I actually had to go back and rewatch it a couple of times when I was putting this video together, because I wasn't sure what that scene was about and what it was for, and I couldn't work out why on earth it was even in the plot, but I could remember the horses and the wagons. But I went back and rewatched it, and sure enough, there's literally no reason for that scene to exist, other than Jamie turning around and saying, oh, I've never had any second thoughts about marrying Claire. Now, we all know that Jamie loves Claire, and that he's probably never had any second thoughts about marrying Claire, but why wasn't that included in another part of the episode, in another conversation, in another scene? It would have made more sense. It just came across odd. And this is going to sound strange, but do you know what all this felt like to me? It felt like bad fan fiction, like when people write their own versions of a story with characters that somebody else has written. Like somebody trying to almost parody Jamie. And that's doubly crazy because Diana Gabaldon wrote this episode and she created the character. And what I think the issue boils down to is, this is an adaptation. So we've had nearly two whole seasons of Jamie the human being as written by the people doing the adaptation. Whereas book Jamie is an incredibly idealized archetype of a hero. Now, I mean, that at least from the first book, he comes across as slightly over the top, slightly too perfect and slightly too amazing. And then in the TV show, they've made him much more rounded and more human. And part of that, Sam Heughan as well, creating this very real character. So then suddenly having him turn up and be this slightly over the top figure like in the books stuck out like a sore thumb to me. It just felt wrong. It felt like needlessly trying to make Jamie cool and make Jamie doing things. And look, Jamie has to be doing something cool in the episode. I've made Jamie do something awesome in the episode. And that was really what it felt like. It felt like she was actually writing just for the sake of making Jamie awesome, rather than just making him real. And that to me didn't really work. Another thing that I felt kind of wrong was the whole Sandringham and Redcoats thing. Now, maybe this was just me not quite understanding the situation, but there was all this stuff about there being troops, and then there was even more troops apparently around the troops that you could see. But then Sandringham says, aha, I got the troops to go away, and it's all going to be safe now. And then 5 minutes later he returns and goes, aha, I was only lying. The troops are only just hiding a wee bit further away because it's all actually a big trap to catch Jamie. But then that all gets forgotten 5 minutes later because there's only appears to be a few troops standing outside the front door. And Hugh manages to sneak right up to the front door and knock one out and then sneak all the way back out to tell Jamie that it's a trap and that Claire's down in the kitchen. Then Jamie and Murtaugh sneak back in and there's no problem at all. It's like, well, where was the trap? It just didn't make sense to me. There wasn't a trap at all. What it felt like was that somebody had thrown in that dialogue to make everything sound dangerous and make it sound more interesting than it actually was. And speaking of dialogue, with the extended conversation between Sandringham and Claire about the comp's death, now that there was something about the editing and writing of that. It just felt really strange because they started the conversation and then it cut away to Mary or to Hugh or to Jamie, and then it would cut back and they were still having the same conversation. And it was like the conversation hadn't moved on. Now that's bad script writing. A good script writer should know that you should advance what's going on in the conversation or do something else. But it just felt like placeholder dialogue. So I mean, sorry, Diana, maybe you should stick to books and not TV scripts. Just saying. But other than that, this was a decent enough episode. And I'm genuinely curious to see how the story's going to go, because apparently there's only 2 more episodes. I thought there was going to be the full 16 this season, but it's only 13. But anyway, till then, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions.